March 22, 1945, a makeshift detention facility near Reims, France. Sofie Braun's hands shook as she stared at the glass bottle placed on the wooden table before her. 21 years old, former Nachrichtenhelferin signal corps operator, captured 4 days earlier during the Allied advance through the Saar region. The liquid inside the bottle was white, pure white, cold enough that condensation beaded on the glass surface. An American guard had called it milk, but Sofie had not seen real milk in 3 years. What passed for milk in the Reich, by 1945, was a gray, watery substance made from powdered skim mixed with chalk dust, and sometimes colored with vegetable dye to approximate the appearance of beaded. This liquid in the glass bottle looked like something from a childhood memory, from a time before rationing, before the war had consumed everything Germany once took for granted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The American sergeant who handed Sofie the bottle watched her reaction with an expression somewhere between curiosity and concern. He said something in English that she didn't understand, then made a drinking motion with his hand. Sofie lifted the bottle to her lips and took a small, cautious sip. The taste exploded across her tongue with an intensity that made her eyes water. It was sweet, rich, creamy in a way that seemed impossible. Real milk, not ersatz, not substitute, not the thin blue liquid that German quartermasters distributed with apologies. This was milk as it existed in her grandmother's kitchen in Saxony, before everything had changed. What Sofie Braun and approximately 4,200 other German women who had served in various auxiliary capacities for the Wehrmacht could not have anticipated was that this single glass of milk represented only the beginning of their confrontation with American material abundance. Within hours they would encounter chocolate cookies, a combination so extravagant, so fundamentally wasteful by German wartime standards, that it would challenge every assumption they held about enemy capabilities and resource management. The mathematics of deprivation were evident in every aspect of Sofie's appearance. Her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, issued 18 months earlier, now hung loosely on a frame that had lost nearly 30 pounds. Her face, once round with the plumpness of youth, had acquired the angular severity of chronic malnutrition. The hollows beneath her cheekbones cast shadows that aged her beyond her years. German women serving in military auxiliary roles had seen their daily caloric intake decline steadily throughout the war, dropping to between 900 and 1,400 calories by early 1945. Those fortunate enough to serve at well-supplied installations might receive slightly more, but most subsisted on quantities that would have seemed criminally inadequate in peacetime. The foods that sustained the German war effort in its final years bore only superficial resemblance to actual nourishment. Coffee consisted of roasted barley or acorns ground into powder, bread incorporated sawdust, ground straw and occasionally crushed leaves to stretch limited flour supplies. Butter had been replaced years earlier, with margarine made from coal tar derivatives. Sugar existed only in theory for most civilians and military personnel. Honey came from chemical processes involving beets and industrial solvents. Meat was a distant memory, appearing perhaps once monthly in rations, and then only in quantities measured by the gram rather than the portion. By March 1945, more than 470,000 German women served in the Wehrmacht and Corps, the military auxiliary service that provided essential support functions across all branches of German armed forces. Half had volunteered in the early war years when victory seemed certain and service carried patriotic prestige. The other half performed mandatory war service, conscripted as Germany's manpower crisis deepened, and the Reich desperately needed bodies to fill roles that kept military operations functioning. These women operated communications equipment, managed supply depots, served as meteorological observers, worked as aircraft spotters, maintained administrative records, and performed countless other tasks that freed men for combat duty. They had been told they were essential to German victory, that their sacrifice and service would be remembered when the Reich achieved its final triumph. Instead, they found themselves prisoners of an enemy whose material resources seemed to defy everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about American weakness. Katrin Vogel, a 23-year-old administrative clerk from Hamburg, had spent 2 years managing supply requisitions for a Luftwaffe training base in occupied France. Her job involved the daily mathematics of scarcity, calculating how to distribute insufficient resources among too many requirements. She knew precisely how many grams of ersatz coffee each pilot trainee received, how many slices of sawdust bread constituted a meal, how many calories the Reich allocated to keep its military functioning at minimal operational capacity. When her unit was overrun by American armored columns during the March offensive, Vogel expected immediate execution, or at best, forced labor under conditions that would make Wehrmacht service seem comfortable by comparison.
Yes.
Nazi propaganda had prepared German women for American barbarism. The enemy soldiers, they were told, were culturally inferior beings, criminals and social degenerates given military uniforms, motivated by base instincts rather than ideological conviction. American society was depicted as collapsing under the weight of racial mixing, economic chaos, and moral decay. The United States, according to Reich Information Services, was on the verge of industrial collapse, its population starving, its military sustained only through British charity and Soviet sacrifice. The reality Katrin Vogel encountered bore no resemblance to these descriptions. American military police, who processed German women prisoners, conducted medical examinations with a thoroughness that exceeded anything Wehrmacht medical services had provided. They treated injuries that German military doctors had dismissed as minor. They provided dental care that many prisoners had never received in their entire lives. They distributed vitamin supplements to address deficiency diseases that German medical doctrine had largely and they fed German prisoners with a generosity that seemed to contradict every principle of wartime resource management. The first meal came within hours of capture, not the thin soup and hard bread that German prisoners expected, but actual food in quantities that seemed designed to demonstrate abundance rather than merely prevent starvation. The bread alone shocked German women into silence. It was white, made from wheat flour without adulterants, soft enough to compress between fingers, fresh enough to still be warm from baking. Anna Kessler, a radio operator from Munich who had coordinated communications for an anti-aircraft battery, touched the bread with the reverence normally reserved for religious objects. She had not seen bread this white, this pure since before the war began. The bread her unit received in its final months was black, dense, heavy with sawdust that gave it a woody aftertaste and a texture that required determined chewing. American soldiers, she observed, handled this white bread casually, sometimes discarding partially eaten slices into waste containers, treating precious wheat flour as if it were an infinite resource. But the milk represented something beyond mere abundance. Dairy products had effectively disappeared from German rations by 1943. What little milk production remained went to hospitals and young children, distributed in quantities so small that most recipients received only enough to add a slight whiteness to their ersatz coffee. The concept of drinking milk as a beverage, consuming an entire glass at one sitting, seemed impossibly extravagant to women who had learned to measure dairy products by the spoonful. The American military had embraced fluid milk as a component of soldier nutrition, recognizing its value in providing calcium, protein, and vitamins that prevented deficiency diseases. Refrigeration technology, still primitive in German military logistics, allowed American forces to maintain cold chains that kept milk fresh across supply lines stretching thousands of miles. The bottles themselves represented industrial capacity that German women had never encountered, uniform glass containers sealed with paper caps, each bottle identical to every other, a standardization that German manufacturing had never achieved even in peacetime. For German women encountering real milk for the first time in years, the experience challenged fundamental assumptions about what their enemies possessed. The cold temperature alone shocked prisoners accustomed to room temperature beverages. The sweetness contradicted memories of the thin, slightly sour liquid that German suppliers called milk. Most disturbing was the casual abundance, American guards pouring generous portions as if dairy were unlimited, as if tomorrow would bring equally fresh supplies without concern or rationing. Helene Fischer, a former supply coordinator from Bremen, wrote in a diary entry that survived American censorship of prisoner correspondence. They gave us milk in glass bottles, cold from ice, sweeter than I remembered milk could be. The American soldiers drank it with their meals as we might drink water if we had clean water. They poured it over cereal, mixed it with coffee, sometimes left partially filled bottles on tables as if milk were too common to warrant careful consumption. I watched one soldier pour milk for a cat that wandered into the mess area. A cat, drinking fresh milk. While German children have forgotten what milk tastes like, the psychological impact of the milk went beyond nutrition. German women had been conditioned to view scarcity as normal, abundance as impossible under wartime conditions. The casual waste they observed, milk spilled without concern, bottles discarded with remaining contents, challenged their understanding of resource management. These were supposed to be the desperate Americans, the economically collapsed society that Nazi propaganda described as hanging on by borrowed resources and fading will. The chocolate cookies arrived on the second day of captivity. American Red Cross volunteers, middle-aged women who spoke German with American accents, distributed packages to prisoner processing areas. Each package contained items that seemed selected specifically to demonstrate American abundance through its most decadent expressions. There were bars of soap that actually produced lather, not the sandy ersatz soap Germans knew. There were cigarettes in quantities that German soldiers might receive over an entire month. And there were chocolate cookies, each one individually wrapped in waxed paper, 6 cookies per package. Sofie Braun held the package uncertainly, unsure if this was some kind of psychological test. Chocolate had disappeared from German civilian access by 1942. What military personnel received as chocolate was a brown substance made from artificial sweeteners and industrial fillers that approximated chocolate's appearance while tasting of chemicals and disappointment. Real chocolate, made from actual cocoa beans, existed only in distant memory. The cookies combined impossibilities. Chocolate, real chocolate judging by the smell, rich and dark. Sugar in quantities that made the cookies actually sweet rather than merely less bitter. Butter, genuine butter that left oil marks on the waxed paper wrapping. The combination represented more luxury than most German women had encountered in 3 years. Each cookie by itself contained more sugar than a German soldier's weekly ration. The package of 6 represented extravagance beyond calculation. American volunteers encouraged the German women to eat the cookies, demonstrating by opening packages themselves and consuming the contents with obvious pleasure. Some prisoners ate immediately, unable to resist the first sweet food they had encountered in years.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Others hoarded the packages, hiding them among their few possessions, unable to believe that such abundance would continue, expecting tomorrow to bring return to familiar scarcity. The taste, when Sofie finally allowed herself to try a cookie, was overwhelming. The chocolate was real, bitter, and sweet simultaneously, with complexity that ersatz versions had never achieved. The cookie itself was crisp, made with real butter that created a richness ersatz fats could not duplicate. Sugar provided sweetness that seemed almost painful after years of its absence. She ate slowly, trying to make the experience last, aware that this might be the only genuine chocolate she would taste for the foreseeable future. What these German women could not have known was that they were experiencing the product of American industrial food systems that operated at scales beyond German comprehension. The chocolate in their cookies came from processing facilities that handled cocoa beans by the ton, shipped from sources across multiple continents, refined using techniques that German industry had never developed. The sugar came from both cane and beet sources, processed in facilities that produced refined white sugar in quantities that would have supplied entire German districts. The cookies themselves were mass-produced, baked in industrial ovens that produced thousands of identical units daily, packaged using automated systems that German food manufacturing had never approached. The distribution network that delivered these cookies to frontline areas, maintaining freshness across thousands of miles, revealed logistical capabilities that made German quartermaster operations seem primitive by comparison. Margar the Schulz, a cryptographic specialist from Berlin who had worked in signals intelligence, approached the chocolate cookies with the analytical mindset her technical training had developed. She examined the waxed paper wrapping, noting the printing quality, the uniformity of the packaging, the way each cookie was protected from damage during transport. The engineering behind something as simple as cookie packaging demonstrated attention to detail and manufacturing precision that exceeded what German military equipment production had achieved. The industrial origins would have seemed like fantasy to women familiar with German food production in the war's final years. By 1945, German bakeries operated without adequate flour, sugar, or fats. What cookies were produced for military rations were hard, tasteless objects that served as edible ballast rather than treats. The concept of industrial-scale cookie production, of factories dedicated to creating sweet foods while a war consumed resources, contradicted everything German women understood about wartime priorities. American cookie factories operated throughout the war, producing not just military rations but civilian products that maintained morale through continued access to familiar comforts. The same industrial capacity that built aircraft and tanks also produced cookies, demonstrating an economy so robust that it could sustain both military necessity and civilian desire simultaneously. German industrial planning had forced choices: guns or butter, victory or comfort. American industry apparently rejected such limitations. The combination of milk and chocolate cookies created experiences that challenged German women's fundamental understanding of their situation. These were prisoners, defeated enemies who should expect harsh treatment and minimal sustenance. Instead, they received foods that German civilians at home could not access, that German soldiers in the field had forgotten existed. The psychological impact was devastating to worldviews built on assumptions of American weakness. Rita Hartman, a telephone operator who had coordinated communications for a Wehrmacht headquarters unit, watched American soldiers in the processing camp eating their own rations and realized that what prisoners received was identical to what their captors consumed. There was no privileged officer class hoarding better food, no systematic deprivation of lower ranks. American privates ate the same cookies, drank the same milk, had access to the same abundance as American officers. The democracy of the mess line contradicted everything German military culture had taught about proper hierarchy. In Wehrmacht service, officers received noticeably better rations, had access to foods that enlisted personnel never saw, maintained visible privilege through superior nutrition. American military feeding seemed designed to eliminate such distinctions, to create equality through shared abundance rather than shared deprivation. The nutritional science began to reveal itself as American medical officers examined German prisoners and discovered widespread malnutrition that resembled starvation conditions. The prescription was systematic feeding designed to restore health, and milk became medicine as much as beverage. The calcium addressed bone weakness that had developed during years of inadequate nutrition. The protein supported muscle recovery. The vitamins prevented deficiency diseases that German medical services had stopped treating. The chocolate cookies, initially dismissed as frivolous treats, served serious nutritional purposes. The sugar provided quick energy that malnourished bodies desperately needed. The fats aided vitamin absorption. The calories helped rebuild tissue that bodies had consumed during extended starvation. American military nutritionists had developed feeding protocols based on scientific research that German medicine had never prioritized. Margaret Reynolds, an American military physician working with German women prisoners, documented the recovery process with clinical precision. Women who arrived weighing under 90 pounds gained 20 to 30 pounds within 2 months of receiving American rations. The milk and cookies initially approached with suspicion became craved as bodies began signaling what they had been missing. The transformation was visible in photographs. Hollow faces filled out, hair regained shine and thickness. Eyes lost the dull vacancy of chronic hunger. The psychological adjustment proved as challenging as physical recovery. German women who had learned to suppress hunger, to ignore their body's distress signals, to function despite constant nutritional stress suddenly faced unlimited access to foods they had believed no longer existed. The mental adaptation required learning to trust that abundance would continue, that tomorrow would bring more milk, that cookie supplies would not suddenly terminate. Many prisoners hoarded food despite reassurances, hiding cookies in their bedding, secreting milk bottles in personal storage areas, unable to overcome years of conditioning that taught scarcity as the only reliable constant. Others ate until they became physically ill, their shrunken stomachs unable to process sudden plenty. American medical staff expected these reactions, had developed protocols for managing refeeding syndrome, understood the psychological dimensions of transitioning from starvation to abundance. The cultural education continued through observation. German women watched American soldiers adding chocolate powder to milk, creating drinks of such sweetness and richness that they seemed designed for celebration rather than routine consumption. They observed cookies being used in trades between soldiers, casually exchanged for cigarettes or magazines, treated as currency of such low value that handful of cookies equaled reading material. The casual creativity particularly impressed prisoners trained in rigid military hierarchies where deviation from protocol invited punishment. American soldiers improvised constantly, creating cookie and milk combinations, crushing cookies into milk to make sweet soups, trading rations to acquire preferred varieties. The flexibility demonstrated confidence in continued supply, assumption that innovation would not be punished because resources were sufficient to tolerate experimentation. American food culture revealed itself through these simple interactions. Soldiers spoke nostalgically about cookies their mothers baked, about milk delivered to childhood homes, about comfort foods that connected them to civilian lives. German women listened to these conversations and realized that American troops treated food as culture rather than mere fuel, used meals to maintain psychological connection to homes thousands of miles away. The letters German women prisoners sent home when censorship permitted communication struggled to convey reality to families surviving on turnip soup and sawdust bread. How could Katrin Vogel explain to her mother in bombed Hamburg that American guards offered second helpings of chocolate cookies? How could Anna Kessler describe to her sister that prisoners drank fresh milk daily while German children developed rickets from calcium deficiency? The contrast seemed so extreme that many prisoners initially avoided mentioning food in their correspondence, unwilling to burden starving families with descriptions of plenty that might seem like cruel mockery. The transformation accelerated as German women began working in American facilities, assigned to tasks that revealed the systems behind the abundance. Those working in mess halls discovered walk-in refrigerators larger than most German apartments stocked with enough dairy products to supply villages. They watched American cooks preparing meals for hundreds without measuring ingredients, confident that supplies would continue regardless of consumption levels. The industrial scale particularly amazed women who had managed household rationing with mathematical precision. American military kitchens operated with assumptions that seemed almost reckless to German sensibilities. Recipes called for ingredients by the pound rather than the gram. Waste was anticipated rather than prevented. Variety was prioritized over efficiency. Multiple cookie types were available simultaneously, different chocolate varieties, various sizes, some with nuts, some without. The psychological impact was devastating to worldviews built on scarcity management. These women had been raised in a culture that praised thrift, that celebrated making do with less, that treated conservation as a moral virtue. American abundance seemed almost immoral by comparison, wasteful in ways that violated deeply held values about resource stewardship, yet the evidence was undeniable. American soldiers were healthier, stronger, more energetic than their German counterparts had been even in the war's early years. The abundance produced results that German efficiency through scarcity had never achieved. Well-fed troops performed better, recovered from illness faster, maintained morale through harsh conditions. The chocolate cookies and fresh milk were not frivolous indulgences but calculated investments in military effectiveness. As spring progressed into summer 1945, German women prisoners faced experiences that continued demolishing their assumptions about American capabilities. The arrival of ice cream in June delivered another psychological shock to women who had forgotten that frozen desserts existed. American military units had portable ice cream machines, equipment dedicated to producing frozen sweets in combat zones, representing industrial capacity and logistical sophistication beyond German comprehension. The ice cream was served with cookies, creating combinations that seemed designed to demonstrate abundance through maximum extravagance. Chocolate cookies with vanilla ice cream, milk served alongside ice cream sundaes. German watched American soldiers consuming these treats casually, sometimes leaving partially eaten servings, discarding food that represented luxury beyond anything available in Germany. The waste particularly troubled prisoners who had been trained to view food conservation as patriotic duty. American soldiers threw away cookies that had broken during transport. They discarded milk that had been sitting too long at room temperature. They prepared more ice cream than could be consumed and discarded the excess rather than storing it for later use. The casual destruction of perfectly edible food violated every instinct German women had developed during 6 years of total war. But the most profound revelation came through understanding why Americans could afford such waste. The industrial systems that produced cookies operated at such scale that broken units were statistically insignificant. The dairy infrastructure that delivered fresh milk daily made yesterday's bottles worthless rather than precious. The ice cream machines were so efficient that producing extra cost less than the labor required to store and redistribute leftovers. German women were witnessing an economy that had solved problems their nation had never addressed. American agriculture produced surplus rather than shortage. American industry created abundance rather than allocating scarcity. American logistics distributed plenty rather than managing deprivation. The chocolate cookies and cold milk were not anomalies but examples of systematic superiority across every dimension of resource management. Sofie Braun, sitting in a prisoner barracks on a warm June evening drinking cold milk while eating a chocolate cookie, realized that everything Nazi propaganda had taught her about American weakness was exactly backwards. The supposedly collapsing American economy had fed German prisoners better than the Reich had fed its own military. The allegedly inferior American industrial system had produced abundance that German manufacturing had never approached. The theoretically doomed American democracy had organized resource distribution more effectively than German authoritarianism had achieved. The psychological transformation deepened as autumn arrived in 1945. German women prisoners had spent 6 months consuming American rations, their bodies recovering from years of systematic starvation. But the mental adjustment proved far more complex than physical healing. These women had internalized scarcity as permanent reality, had built identities around managing deprivation, had learned to find pride in surviving on minimal resources. American abundance challenged not just their assumptions but their sense of self. Katrin Vogel found herself experiencing what American medical officers termed reverse nostalgia. She missed the clarity of scarcity, the simple moral universe where conservation was virtue and waste was sin. American plenty created moral ambiguity that troubled her deeply. Was it right to drink fresh milk when German children had none? Could she justify eating chocolate cookies while her family survived on ersatz rations? The questions haunted her even as her body thrived on nutrition it had desperately needed. The repatriation process began in October 1945, and with it came the cruelest irony these women would face. They were being sent home, released from captivity, granted freedom to return to families they had not seen in years. Yet home meant leaving abundance for starvation, departing comfortable imprisonment for uncertain liberation. The prospect of returning to sawdust bread and ersatz coffee after months of white bread and fresh milk created anxiety that American staff had not anticipated. German women preparing for repatriation began hoarding food with desperate intensity. They secreted cookies in their luggage, hid bottles of powdered milk in clothing, attempted to carry physical evidence of American abundance back to communities that would not believe their stories without proof. American guards generally ignored these violations of baggage regulations, understanding that returning prisoners needed talismans of the world they had briefly inhabited. The final meals before departure were deliberately generous, as if American authorities wanted to send one last message about their capabilities. Fresh milk accompanied every meal. Chocolate cookies appeared in quantities that exceeded even the generous daily distributions prisoners had grown accustomed to. Ice cream arrived as a farewell gesture, served with cookies in combinations that now seemed normal rather than extravagant. Sofie Braun ate her last American meal slowly, trying to memorize flavors she might never experience again. The cold milk sweet and rich, the chocolate cookies crisp and buttery. The knowledge that tomorrow would bring return to familiar deprivation made each bite both precious and painful. She was gaining freedom but losing security, trading captivity for liberty in a world where liberty meant hunger. The transport ships that carried German women back to Europe were stocked with American rations for the journey, even in transit, even technically no longer prisoners. These women continued receiving milk and cookies, bread and butter, foods that would disappear the moment they stepped onto German soil. The contrast became more vivid with each mile that brought them closer to home. Letters written during the voyage revealed the psychological complexity of their situation. Anna Kessler wrote to a friend who had remained in America as a displaced person. "I am going home, but I am also leaving home. The Germany I knew no longer exists, and the Germany that exists cannot provide what I have learned to expect. How do I explain to my mother that I ate chocolate cookies while she starved? How do I tell my sister about fresh milk when her children have rickets from calcium deficiency?" The ships docked in Hamburg and Bremen, ports that had been bombed into rubble, cities that bore no resemblance to the prosperous urban centers these women remembered. The destruction was total, systematic, as if some malevolent force had deliberately erased the physical infrastructure of German civilization. Buildings stood as hollow shells, streets were impassable with debris. The population that emerged to meet returning prisoners looked skeletal, gray-faced, moving with the shuffling gait of the chronically malnourished. German relief workers who processed returning prisoners offered thin soup and hard bread, apologizing for the meager rations with explanations about transport difficulties and supply shortages. The women who had spent months drinking fresh milk and eating chocolate cookies accepted sawdust bread without complaint, unable to explain that what seemed normal to German relief workers now felt like punishment to bodies that had learned to expect abundance. The contrast became starker as these women dispersed to their home communities. Sofie Braun returned to her village in Saxony and discovered that her family was surviving on food aid provided by international relief organizations. The aid packages contained powdered milk, a pale imitation of the fresh dairy she had consumed daily in American captivity. They contained hard biscuits that bore no resemblance to the chocolate cookies she had taken for granted. Her younger sister, 14 years old and visibly malnourished, asked about prison camp conditions with the assumption that captivity had been harsh. Sofie found herself unable to explain that American imprisonment had been more comfortable than German freedom. How could she tell her starving sister about the waste she had witnessed, about cookies discarded half-eaten, about milk poured out because it had sat too long? The truth seemed cruel, as if abundance were something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. German authorities worried about the influence of returning prisoners. Reports from local officials described former captives expressing dangerous opinions about American systems, making favorable comparisons between democratic capitalism and German approaches to resource management. Women who had witnessed American abundance became inadvertent advocates for methods that challenged occupation authorities and German traditionalists alike. Katrin Vogel organized a community meeting in Hamburg where she demonstrated American cooking techniques she had learned. She showed how to make the most of limited ingredients, but she also spoke honestly about the abundance she had witnessed. American soldiers eat fresh bread daily, she told her neighbor. They drink real milk at every meal. They have chocolate cookies as ordinary rations, not special treats. The audience listened with expressions mixing disbelief and hunger, unable to reconcile her descriptions with their understanding of wartime reality. The cultural impact extended beyond individual testimonies. German women who had experienced American abundance brought back expectations that German society could not meet. They had seen proof that hunger was not inevitable, that societies could produce surplus rather than manage scarcity. They had learned that abundance was achievement rather than accident, the product of systems that prioritized productivity over ideology. Local German officials found themselves defending scarcity to populations that now knew alternatives existed. Why couldn't German agriculture produce fresh milk? Why didn't German industry create chocolate in quantities sufficient for general consumption? Why did German logistics fail to distribute food effectively when Americans had managed it across oceans and continents? The questions had no satisfactory answers because they exposed systematic failures that ideology could not explain. The nutritional knowledge these women carried proved particularly valuable. Anna Kessler worked with a local clinic, teaching mothers about protein requirements and vitamin deficiencies using information she had learned from American medical officers. She explained that children needed calcium for bone development, that adults required certain amino acids for health, that malnutrition was disease rather than inevitable hardship. The scientific approach contradicted German folk wisdom that had treated hunger as character building rather than pathological. German Reconstruction gradually began incorporating lessons that returning prisoners brought home. Agricultural cooperatives experimented with American farming techniques. Food distribution networks adopted logistics methods observed in American operations. Most significantly, expectations shifted from managing scarcity toward creating abundance, from rationing limited resources toward expanding production capacity. The long-term impact of those chocolate cookies and glasses of milk extended far beyond individual nutrition. That demonstrated that abundance was achievable, that democratic systems could outperform authoritarian alternatives in the most basic measure of governmental success, the ability to feed populations adequately. The simple American combination of milk and cookies had accomplished what no propaganda campaign could achieve, proving through daily experience that different systems produce different results. Sofie Braun, sitting in her reconstructed village 10 years after her repatriation, drinking milk with her own children, reflected on the journey that had brought her from Wehrmacht auxiliary to American prisoner to German citizen of a rebuilding nation. The milk was German now, produced by recovering dairy farms, not as rich as American milk had been but recognizable as the genuine article rather than ersatz substitute. Her children ate cookies made with real chocolate, imports from Switzerland that demonstrated Germany's gradual return to prosperity. She never forgot the taste of that first American milk, the shock of abundance after years of deprivation. She remembered the chocolate cookies that had seemed so impossibly extravagant, the casual waste that had troubled her German sensibilities, the realization that everything she had been taught about American weakness was propaganda rather than truth. Those memories shaped how she raised her children, teaching them that prosperity was possible, that abundance could be achieved through systems that prioritized production over ideology. The German women who had been prisoners of American forces carried forward lessons learned through the simple. They had discovered that democracy's strength lay not in ideology but in results, not in promises but in delivery. They had tasted the future through milk and chocolate cookies, and that future was sweet in ways that extended far beyond flavor. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.